Hello everyone and welcome. This is lecture 3 and our subject for this week is language. So you've read a couple things about language and its relationship to culture, and I want to start there with some of those broader issues, and then we'll get into some of the more specifics of the ways that anthropologists and others have studied language and some of the most important insights that they have learned that are relevant to our study of cultural anthropology. Language and culture are intimately connected to one another. Indeed, all of the characteristics of culture that we talked about earlier in the course apply equally well to language. Language is, in fact, the primary medium by which culture is enacted and passed from generation to generation, right? The way that we inform children how to behave is through enacting things, but a lot of it is through our use of language. Language is shared, it's used creatively, it's passed across generations, etc., etc. So we can think of language and culture as intertwined and parallel aspects of what it means to be human. Also, something that language has in common with culture more generally is that it's symbolic. Indeed, language is, by definition, a system of symbols. Symbols are simply things that stand in for something else, right? One of the most important characteristics of symbols is that they are arbitrary. What we mean by that is that there's no inherent meaning to the symbol used to represent a certain meaning in a certain language. It's arbitrarily assigned. It only carries meaning insofar as that meaning is recognized and agreed upon by the people speaking that language, okay? And in fact, your book gives you a really good example of this that I think demonstrates it really clearly, which is 3 words that when you say them, they all sound exactly the same. Key, 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 right? So as a sort of a sound that is a symbol, a linguistic symbol for something, they appear to be identical, except for that in their different languages in which they appear, they mean totally different things, right? A key in English being an object we use to unlock a door, key in French meaning who, key in Japanese meaning tree. Okay, so that's the sort of arbitrariness of language. This again underlines the way that language and culture are intertwined. There's nothing inherent in the sounds we make that gives them meaning. It's the cultural context and the use by people that gives them that meaning. As your reading also pointed out, when anthropologists think about language, we're thinking about a lot more than just the most obvious bits, right? Just the sounds that come out of someone's mouth or the words that we know that those sounds are enunciating. There's a lot of other elements of communication that anthropologists also look at. These are referred to as kinesics, proxemics, and paralanguage, among other things, okay? And what we're talking about here are things like body language, right? How you or whether you use your hands when you talk. Proxemics, how close you stand to people when you communicate with them. Paralanguage, all the little other sounds and indicators of what you're trying to say beyond just the words, okay? So the way you move your body, the way you express emotion on your face, how you physically interact with other people, all of these are elements of your communication in cultural context. And as such, anthropologists and linguists and others are also very much interested in those bits. So thinking about not just language in a sort of by the book way, right? Like as just sort of words on a page, but communication more generally. Now, an interesting question that comes up for anthropologists and others who study language is whether the ways that humans make use of language is indeed fundamentally different than the communication systems employed by other kinds of animals. And indeed, there's a parallel conversation in anthropology about whether culture as a human phenomenon is in fact exclusive to humans. For example, do non-human primates also do something that we can recognize as culture? So What we find when we look at the evidence about language is that although non-humans communicate, of course, and communicate in quite complex ways, there's no doubt, there are ways in which human communication, human language is distinctive, okay? And as your book talks about it, one way to capture that set of differences is thinking about closed versus open communication systems, right? Human language is an open system. What that means is that it's possible to create new meanings, right? We can string together words in novel ways to express things that haven't been expressed before in precisely that way, right? So there's a level of possibility for creativity, for sort of pushing into new areas of communication that exists with human language that does not exist in the same way with non-human language. Another way that human language is different than animal communication is something called displacement. And that is the ability that human language has to talk about things that are not right here or right now, okay? To reference things that are from the past, right? Or that don't exist and are just a fantasy about the future. Or to talk about things that exist but they're not in sight, they're somewhere else, right? So there's a degree of abstraction or displacement that human language is able to engage in that we find that animal communication systems do not. Okay, so in terms of studying language, right, if those are some of the general characteristics of language, what we want to turn to now is the different ways that researchers try to understand language. This is an anthropology class, so we're primarily here interested in the work of linguistic anthropologists. We talked in the very beginning of the class about anthropology as a very broad, holistic discipline. And one of the components of anthropology is linguistic anthropology, which focuses primarily on language, okay? Cultural anthropologists and archaeologists also study about language, right? So it's not just linguistic anthropologists, but they really dig into language systems and language usage in a way that's more focused than what cultural anthropologists do, who are looking at language, among other things, in people's lives. These columns that I've set up on this slide are just to give you sort of a sense of the different ways that language is studied, and I've compared a couple of different ways. On the left are researchers who are primarily, in their study of language, who are primarily interested in the form that language takes. This is a field that within the discipline of linguistics is often called descriptive linguistics. And that kind of study focuses on the grammar of a language, that is, its structure, right? How it is put together. One of the key sort of famous linguists that you might find associated with this kind of study is Noam Chomsky, who is mentioned in your book, and his concept of the universal grammar, which we'll talk about more in a second. On the other hand, anthropologists who study language are often as interested in the use of language. So not just how the language is technically organized, but how people actually use it, how it comes out of people's mouths, okay? So this is fields like linguistic anthropology, or the part of linguistics that's called sociolinguistics. So again, it's not ignoring things like the structure and grammar, but it's interested in basically language in practice, not language in theory, okay? So the ways that people speak and the social context of language use. In terms of the study that we are talking about as linguistic anthropology, a couple of the key players for this approach are Saper and Worf, who you read about, and their key concept of linguistic relativity, which we'll also talk about in a second. In the second column, I'd also put some of the other kinds of important concepts for thinking about language that we're going to talk about in this lecture and that are mentioned in your reading. Things like code switching, right? So code switching is not about really the structure, like, how many kinds of nouns are there. It's more about how do people employ language, or in this case, multiple languages, in their day-to-day lives in response to the social context in which they find themselves. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about code switching in a few minutes. All right, so back to those key theories that I mentioned on the previous slide. In the field of linguistics and thinking about the sort of universal elements of language, we have the concept of the universal grammar. This was first put forward by Noam Chomsky. And the concept of the universal grammar is that the human brain contains basically a plan. It comes hardwired into the brain. And that plan is the basis for all language learning. This theory is built on some basic things that we can observe about language learning in general across the world. And that is that no matter what the language, no matter where people are, no matter what their educational level, etc., children, for the most part, learn to speak and use their native tongue at the same moment in their development, right? That there is a sort of a life course progression to how language becomes a part of what human beings do, right? It's not the case that it varies from culture to culture, from place to place, or from language to language. Chomsky started from that basic idea, right? That children learn how to speak basically through being exposed to adult speakers around them and pick it up at a sort of consistent pace in their first years of life. That led him to think of this as, again, a universal hardwired, basically neurobiological phenomenon. Now, on the other side of that sort of analysis is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is also referred to as linguistic relativity in your read-it. And you read a bit about Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf, the two theorists who first came up with this, right? And this notion of linguistic relativity has been extremely important, especially for anthropology and the anthropological study of language. And it's quite different from what Chomsky is saying. So whereas Chomsky is focusing on the sort of the human universal elements of language and language learning, linguistic relativity focuses precisely on the variability across languages. What linguistic relativity suggests is that different languages produce different ways of thinking. That basically the structure of the language that you learn first, right, your native language, the structure of that language becomes a sort of lens through which you view and experience the world around you, okay? So you could think about things like, for example, if the way that verb tenses are organized leads you to understand time as passing from past to present to future, because the way that verb tenses are organized, then you will come to conceptualize time as a straight line, basically. Right? Straight line coming out of the past, passing through the present into the future, right? We almost, as I'm saying this, right, you can visualize, and we see this all the time, right? Think about the way that history is often represented as a timeline, literally a straight line moving horizontally across the page with little nicks on it where key things have happened, right? So the linguistic relativity theory suggests that's not just how time is. That is a concept of time that is forwarded by the way that language or the set of languages is organized. And indeed, there are other ways that languages organize time and therefore other conceptualizations of time. So this goes directly to the study of Hopi language by Whorf that you read a bit about. So it's part of what inspired Whorf to sort of put forward or to contribute to that notion of linguistic relativity, right? So that timeline approach to time, right? Past, present, future, moving along unidirectionally in a straight line. That's what's being represented here. And that's how many Westerners imagine time. It's built into the way the verb tenses of a language like English operate. So if you look down here, these are the English language verb tenses that correspond to this passage of time as a straight line from past to present to future, right? So the past perfect, I had been doing my homework. Past, I had done it. Past, I was doing it. Getting closer to the present now, I have been doing it. I have done it. I'm doing it. I will do it. I will have done it, right? This is a model of time, and it is also a system for organizing verb tenses. Worf, as you read, studied the Hopi language, and what he found is that Hopi verb tenses are not organized like this. They don't have the same relationship to time. Instead of this kind of past, present, future schema, what Worf found is that Hopi language distinguished between basically two categories. There were two kinds of verb tenses, and he called them manifested, and those included verbs that referred to the present, past, and future, as well as the physical universe. And then there was another category of verbs which was unmanifest. And that included both the distant past and the future, and other things, more abstract elements like desires, thoughts, life forces. So again, this is a very different way of organizing verbs, and, Worf would argue, it reflects and informs a different way of understanding time. Okay, so that's linguistic relativity. Culture and language are intimately connected, so connected that the way the language is organized becomes a basically model of how the world works. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, anthropologists interested in language are interested in the ways that people use language. And there's a few really key sort of ideas that have emerged from that I think are really important to this class that I want to point out to you. Okay, and these are all things, again, that were mentioned in one form or another in your readings. So the first is the notion of code switching. Code switching is the idea that people switch from one language or one style of language to another in response to cues from the social setting that they are in. Okay? So, and indeed, this is the subject of a discussion that you guys are going to participate in, right? On our discussion board. I'm asking you to think about code switching. The more obvious examples of code switching are when people who are bilingual or trilingual, multilingual, when they speak, will often switch from one language to the other depending on who they're with or where they are, right? I'm sure some of you listening to this do that yourselves, right? When you're talking to a friend, you may be using one language, you get a phone call from someone from your family, you switch on a dime into that other language, right? So that's switching, tacking back and forth between more than one language is code switching. Now, we can extend that notion to include people who are not necessarily bilingual. So even if you speak one language, right? So you're not switching between, say, English and Spanish or Spanish and French. You're speaking, say, English and English only. You still engage in code switching. It's just that you're not switching from one language to another. You're switching from one style of language to another. So think, for example, about the difference between how you speak to your best friend versus how you speak to your grandmother versus how you speak to a teacher versus how you speak to a child, right? You may be speaking the same language. Any one of those people would understand what you were saying, but you will change up something about how you communicate depending on that social context. This is code switching. And I think it's interesting both because it shows people's sort of ability to adjust their communication to their setting, And also because it shows just how malleable people are, right? If you've ever switched from one language to another or one form of language to another, you'll notice that you often don't have to think about it. It's almost automatic. Sometimes you might mess up, right? And not quite fully switch or mix things together. That's a common practice too. So we end up with sort of mixed languages. When people do a lot of switching, they may end up with a sort of hybrid language. But you're also very good, or people in general are very good at both reading the social setting they're in and getting their sort of language to switch over to that quite readily. Okay, so that's one key thing we want to keep in mind, code switching. Another sort of related issue is the broader point of how language and identity are connected. So again, even within the same language, right, people all speaking the same language, we find some variations that have to do with people's social identity within the particular cultural world they live in. So identity distinctions around things like socioeconomic class, ethnicity, gender, all of those sort of social positions inform how people talk, right? And they aren't such drastic differences that, for example, a woman can't understand what a man says. That's not the case. Obviously, those communications happen all the time. But there are some differences in style of communication, right? And sometimes there are differences in sort of slang terms and whatever else, right? But again, this just takes us back to that broader issue, which is that language and culture, language and social context are intimately connected. So nobody is speaking language out of a textbook, right? You're not speaking out of a grammar book. You're speaking in social context. And what that means is that language is shaping itself to fit the experiences and the communication styles of the people using it. Language is also often very political, okay? And I wanted to bring this up as another theme, I think, that is important to the anthropology of language. And I mean this in a couple of different ways. One is there's a certain sort of set of political questions around even how we characterize or categorize languages. You read a little bit about this in the chapter that you read for this week. For example, the assertion that certain versions of a language are the standard version versus other versions that may be called a dialect. There's a lot of debate about that. Whether that diminishes or puts in a lower level in a hierarchy those alternate ways of speaking. And the fact of the matter is, again, the assertion that a certain language or a certain form of a language is standard is also assertion of power, right? It's saying this is the correct way or the original way or the default way, and everything else is something other. So there's a lot of, again, pushback about this idea of assigning any form of language the role of dialect. Another way in which language is political is in terms of some of the turns of phrase that we use, or the metaphors, right? That is the sort of the images that we use as a common part of our communication. And this goes directly to the other reading you did for this week, the reading by Tannen, who is a very interesting linguist who has done a lot of work on exactly all the stuff on this slide, right? Like how social context and language are related to one another, okay? For example, this is just a sidebar, but she has some very interesting work on communication and gender, where she looked at how men and women in American workplaces communicate, and what it meant for stuff like whether people get along with their coworkers, whether people respect their bosses, all these things, right, were related to some subtle differences in language usage by men and women. So that's the kind of work that she does. In the piece that you read, which she's looking at, is something that I think is very timely. We've seen a lot about recent public discourse that I think goes to this issue that she's raising, which is what she refers to as agonism. And what she's talking about here is the sort of use of a lot of warlike imagery in public discourse, particularly in political rhetoric and in media coverage of politics. So language that, again, sort of sneaks in the imagery of battle to stuff that is not a war, right? Even if it feels like it some way sometimes. And she suggests that has an effect, right? So the language is not just reflecting, the language is also influencing. So the more that sort of war imagery makes it into our descriptions of what, for example, is going on in Washington, D.C., for example, the more there's a sort of understanding and an expectation of this combative, antagonistic approach to governing. Okay, so again, metaphors, a part of language, right, through and through, but one that we want to recognize as not incidental, as important and meaningful. Okay. Another key issue that anthropologists are interested in is how language changes over time. We all know that language is constantly evolving, right? It's not something that is ever static. And that can, sort of from the perspective of the anthropologists who study it, that can be something that causes concern. Some of the change causes concern. And some of it is, I think, just what we would recognize as par for the course, right? Just as culture changes over time, so does language. So language shifts, for example, as people move around, right? We know that humans are and have been from the very beginnings of our species incredibly mobile. So we find that people moving from one place to another bring elements of their language, develop hybrid languages, and there's also shifts within populations that move, for example, across generations. One of the things that your reading mentioned was the phenomenon, which is certainly a common part of life in the United States, where in immigrant communities, there may be different kinds of language skills and language use across generations, right? The generation that moves from one country to another will have a different relationship to both their home language and the language that they encounter in the United States than their children will, who are raised here, who may speak one language at home and another, for example, at school. So that notion of sort of multiple language usage across the generations of a single family is certainly a part of the kind of language change that anthropologists are interested in. In the sort of at the more concerning end of language change, anthropologists are also interested in languages that are under threat. And indeed, language death is an issue in certain parts of the world. So, for example, this is a site that I just wanted to bring up, which is about what are referred to as language hotspots. And you can see, sorry, it's a little bit off the screen here, but some areas that where languages are under threat of extinction, right? So, for example, if we go and look at one of these hotspots, which is in Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico. So these are indigenous North American languages, which are highly endangered, right? And the way that endangerment is often gauged is in terms of not even just how many people can speak the language, but where they are in their own lives. So, for example, the process of endangerment and then extinction often starts with children no longer being able to speak it, and then middle-aged people no longer being able to speak it. And finally, if the only remaining speakers are, 60 years or older, then you know that the language is in real danger, right? Because at that point, you do not have the passage of the language between the generations. That is what, like culture, as we've discussed, keeps language moving forward, is passing it from one generation to the next. If there are only elderly people who are the only ones who know how to speak a language, then sadly, almost inevitably, that language is going to die out. Okay? There are cases where, in response to those kinds of threats, communities have worked actively to try to stave off language death. Your book mentioned this, and this, in fact, this is from this image here is from a website connected to a language reclamation project in Massachusetts, which is being enacted by an indigenous Native American group that is working to keep the language alive. And that includes, for example, teaching it to children, right? Having language schools where little kids are learning how to speak it. That is what keeps language going, right? Is training the next generation in speaking it. So I wanted to end on something that I think is good food for thought and also falls under this sort of umbrella of language innovation. There's in part because I know, we're talking about language sort of at a moment where there's a lot of conversation about how we communicate vis-a-vis the technologies that are now such an important part of our lives. And we've all heard these concerns, right? Particularly about things like texting. The linguist John McWhorter has a different sense of texting, what it is and what it means. So I want to end this lecture by having you watch a brief speech by McWhorter. I've got the link to the speech here. I've also placed a link in the same folder on D2L where this lecture is located. So once you're done here, please go on over, watch that McWhorter talk, and that will be the last bit of this week's lecture. I will talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.